Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into an exciting one. It is another first beer from a new to me brewer. This is one I did get from Tavour. And this is a beer that is a style we haven't done very many of on this channel because they're not that easy to come by. Today we're jumping into Skookum Brewery's Deep Color. This is a 2021 release of an old ale that has been whiskey barrel aged in a combination of Willet and Woodinville whiskey barrels for 14 months. Skookum Brewery is based in Arlington, Washington, 11.5% ABV on this one. So old ale. Yeah, we've only ever gotten a handful of these. Even if you go somewhere with a massive selection like Total Wine, good luck finding an old ale. You're more likely to find a barley wine than an old ale. And it's just a style that, at least in the United States, isn't really all that popular. A lot of people don't know anything about it. So old ale, it's one of the higher ABV, darker, more malt-centric beer styles. I'm pretty sure the old ale came out of the UK, and you know, there's a lot of history behind the style and kind of if it was aged and then added to kind of cut some of the younger beers and boost them up, and things evolved over time. But it does share a lot of commonality with these higher ABV, darker, malt-centric beers, strong ales, barley wines, wheat wines, anything of that nature. But traditionally, it's going to be a higher ABV, malt-centric beer. So it's not one we see often. When I saw this pop up in Tavour, I did decide to grab it. Label art on this one, it's a very dark label. It says Deep Color, very clean design, and this is wax dipped. So as always, we'll take the trusty pointy end of our bottle opener, score through the wax directly underneath the edge of the cap, which will give us a, hopefully, if we get enough off, a good place that we can jump in here and get a good grip to get that cap off. Yep, no problem at all. As always, I'm just gonna clean just the edge of where I just ripped that wax off in case there's any small loose bits that might want to fall in the beer. Not the end of the world, but not like having to fish them out. So no problem at all on that. Using a nice little stem glass, this ought to work well. Wouldn't be a bad choice if this weren't barrel aged, but since it is, I really wanted to make sure that I got a nice kind of fluted glass shape here. So let's get this poured right in. Oh yeah, that's a nice dark beer. Don't want to be too aggressive in this little skinny glass, but it formed a pretty decent head. At least enough that I'll get some notes out of it. So, oh yeah, big. So yeah, you can immediately smell the whiskey. That comes out readily apparent. And there's also a ton of underlying toffee and caramel and fig and plum and raisin. It's got an aroma that is remarkably similar to a barley wine. Indeed, the styles could be very, very much considered of a like type, although there are different kind of characteristics that will generate them into their own category, and certainly the historical significance of the styles and how they came about. But they do share a lot in common. So if you've never had an old ale, definitely worth keeping your eyes peeled. It's not a style you're going to see a lot, but I do recommend picking them up, especially if you've never tried one, when they do pop in, because you never know. It could be years before the next opportunity arises. Nonetheless, this one smells fantastic. Obviously, the head got out of the way pretty quickly. I expected that on this style for the same reason I would expect it on a barley wine. It'll form a bit, let you get the detail that you need before you jump into sip, and I wanted to explore the aroma before I jumped into the profile. So visually, yeah, it's a nice, deep, rich, dark, caramelly brown. Not dissimilar to the shade kind of in the middle between a typical porter and a brown ale. It's that deep brown. It's not pitch black, but it's a very, very deep brown, very malt-centric, roasty malts. So without further ado, we're going to jump right in this beer, see what it's about. Oh yeah, that is fantastic. Wow. Okay, so the first thing I can tell you is that the body and the mouthfeel is nice. It's weighty. This is 11.5% ABV beer, so it's got some heft to it. Though it's not quite as oppressively heavy as I expected for this ABV range, and it's not quite as resistant as I expected for this ABV range, but it's nice. It's above average. So put the two together and it's got presence to it. I'm not suggesting it feels light at all. Just for the ABV range, I would expect a little more oomph coming out of it, but it's got presence to it. If we immediately turn and start talking about this flavor profile, the first thing you get immediately up front as you swallow is this wonderful warming sensation as it goes down. It's 11.5% ABV. They aged it in whiskey barrels, a blend of them, for 14 months. That's a lot of time in the barrel, and it does impart a ton of character. Obviously, in the aroma, it hit us huge. It's hitting us huge on the palate as well. Very nice whiskey. The blend goes extremely well with the malt bill. And yes, there are a lot of flavor character traits in this beer, and indeed old ales in general, that do share a ton of common ground with barley wines in particular, but there's even some gap bridging with strong ales. So I said these are all kind of interrelated styles, although they are their own separate animals. That is true. But when we talk specifically more in detail about the malt bill profile of this, I think you will start to see how related they really are, but how they are distinctly separate. So the first thing I can tell you is that a ton of the aroma that I got on this beer is translated directly into the glass. There's a lot of rich, rich undertones of caramel, and we're talking dessert-like caramel, like a caramel cake that's been maybe whiskey soaked. Absolutely delicious. Yes, there's a little bit of fig that comes through in the flavor profile, but there's a lot more kind of underlying plum flavor that comes through. And again, we're not talking like taking a bite out of a fresh plum. This is very much like you're in a cobbler or it's mixed into a soaked, just gooey dessert cake. But where this puts me a lot more in line with profiles that I would find in a strong ale versus a barley wine, although they do share common ground, is the other underlying roasty malts in this bill. And there's a big underpinning of some very deep cacao as well as coffee undertones coming through in this beer, which you often get in strong ales, but you rarely get in barley wine. Yes, it's possible you could get those, but that would be the exception and not the norm. So an old ale kind of sitting in the middle between them, and they can run the gamut with various characteristics, both in terms of aroma and in flavor profile, certainly in the ABV range as well. But these are all three very much malt-centric, traditionally darker beer styles. Again, they can run in a spectrum. This is certainly in it. But yeah, so this specific old ale in particular does share a lot of commonality with barley wine, though it's not identical, and it does share a lot of commonality with the strong ale. And again, it's not identical. It is its own thing. And this is a very, very good example. I have not had a ton of old ales. This one is easily in the upper echelon of those that I have had to date. I would have to really dig back through my notes on recent years' old ale reviews, but I just suspect this would probably be the top of the heap. And if I'm thinking before I started my channel, I had only ever had a few old ales prior, and none of them were on this level of complexity, or certainly even in this ABV range. This is a big special one. Very, very good. So we're going to jump back in, second sip, let everything re-intensify as always. Make sure I didn't miss anything critical to tell you, then we will talk about the balance and the finish. But on first sip, this is a fantastic beer. Take two. Yeah, it's immediate whiskey barrel right up front. It's big, it's warming. As soon as that goes down, you start getting big notes of plum, big notes of caramel. Again, it's very dessert-like, cake-like, cobbler-like candied, and it's rich caramel. It's not light, it's rich. It's like deeply caramelized sugar. And then you start getting slight suggestions of raisin. There's even some subtleties of grape coming out of this, which is also quite nice. And as that malt bill starts to open up, as the upfront intensity of the barrel dials back a little bit and starts to just kind of plateau, that's when you get this underlying rich cacao and slight coffee character. In fact, on second sip, the coffee traits that are coming out of this beer are getting far more pronounced. And it does take right about 10 seconds, but it progressively slowly intensifies and intensifies and intensifies. It makes for a very nice, very, very complex layered beer drinking experience. So how does all of this big activity happening translate into the balance? Well, I gotta say it's balanced extremely well. These two whiskey barrels work very, very well for the beer that they made here. And the malts that they selected are absolutely fantastic. They also pair very well with their barrel selection. So what we have is another one of these big, complex, yes, it's barrel aged. That's just another added element of layering, another added bonus to the beer drinking experience. Even if that weren't here, this would be a fantastically complex and huge beer. But the fact that it is here is just the cherry on top. But what I can say is all of these layers of complexity really do uniquely have their own voice. They pop in and out at different points in time on the finish, but you do get to fully taste everything that this beer that they put into it has to offer very clearly and independently as separate flavors. And it's absolutely fantastic. In terms of bittering in this one, it's not a hop forward beer style. It's not about the big hop bitters. So this is really malt centric. It's not a sweet beer. And yes, there are some subtle bitters, but it's mild. But in terms of the finish, it's not bittering that pushes it out. It's a combination of both the pungency of the barrels in which this beer was aged, as well as the overall intensity of the flavors that are popping out of this malt bill. It's very, very big, long after each sip, very clearly still lingering on the palate. I'm left with a mixture of the barrel in particular, and I'm also left with a ton of caramel and that underlying kind of plum essence. The kind of grape parts that I was getting in the middle and the underlying cacao and coffee, they're out of the way once you're near the minute plus mark. But it does last a very, very long time. This is not a dry beer. It's very wet. It's very round. It does do a good job of coating the palate, and it really does let these flavors stick out long after each sip, which is fantastic because it's truly delicious. I'm going to take my time sip on this one, call it my scores. When we come back, we will get this beer ranked from top to bottom. All right, now that we've gotten to enjoy this beer, we're going to get it ranked. This was Skookum Brewery out of Arlington, Washington. Their 2021 release of Deep Color, Whiskey Barrel Old Age, dual barrels, Willet and Woodinville for 14 months. This one clocks in at 11.5% ABV. So this was a very, very good beer. As I said, old ales are not the easiest style to find. So my recommendation, if you're like me, you like to try a lot of beers, a lot of styles, you like it all, this is one you're not going to come across often. I did get mine from Tavour for what it's worth. This was just a great beer, a wonderful experience for a first beer from a new-to-me brewer. This beer kind of had it all. And as I described it, obviously, like I said, these are big malty beers, and they do share common traits with both barley wines and with strong ales, but they are distinctly their own thing. And this was a really good example of what I'm talking about there. Nonetheless, across the board, this did extremely well. 3 categories it didn't get a perfect score, so we're just going to jump straight to the 3 in question. The first of those is the body. Yes, the body was nice. It was above average. It did not feel like a light beer at all, but for the ABV range for this beer, I did expect it to have just a little more oomph than it had. It was kind of on the border-ish of medium heavy, but I expected it to be almost a full rounded heavy. 11.5%, that's a high ABV, a lot of fermentables in there, but again, above average. I did give the body a 7 out of 10. The mouthfeel is the second category that did not get a perfect score, and it was kind of a similar reason as the body. It definitely had a noticeable amount of resistance. You could feel it. It didn't feel thin or just the same resistance as water on the palate, but it wasn't quite as resistant as I expected for the ABV range. It didn't get creamy, it didn't get foamy, it didn't get bubbly when you agitate it around the palate. You could feel it. It just wasn't as thick as I expected for this ABV. The mouthfeel, I also gave a 7 out of 10. The final category that did not get a perfect score, you might already be able to guess, that was the head and retention. as soon as I poured this, I said, okay, this is one of those classic. It's just, it is what it is. It's kind of typical for the style. A lot of quick activity with the effervescence and the carbonation rising, and it does collapse the head underneath it pretty quickly. So yeah, it didn't stick around a very long time, but this is pretty prototypical for the style. So it's just average. It wasn't bad, it wasn't great. It's just average. I did give the head and retention a 5 out of 10, which does leave a perfect 10 out of 10 in the remaining 7 categories. That's the aroma, the taste, the finish, the appearance, balance, feeling, and intangible, my subjective thoughts category, and example of style. So the total score on Skookum Brewery's 2021 release of Deep Color is an 89 out of 100. Well above average, guys. And look, I say this all the time when I have what I believe is a truly great beer, and indeed a particularly truly great example of a style. This checks both of those boxes. But I am completely objective in what I experience, except for my single subjective category, which I gave it top marks. And look, it is what it is. For the ABV, the body and the mouthfeel may not have been as weighty and as resistant as expected, but they were both still above average. Head and retention, it's not that big of a deal, but it is what it is. It got what it got, just average 4 or 5. So look, 89, it's a great score. And really, these categories are, in the grand scheme of what the beer drinking experience was with this, completely insignificant. But I have to rate what I experienced. So take it for what it's worth. This is one that I would recommend all day long. If you can somehow get your hands on this, if you are an old ale fan, or if you've never had one and you like bigger malt-centric beers like barley wines and strong ales, this is one I would absolutely keep on my radar. I got mine from Tavour. Check Tavour, see if it pops up in the rotation again. Maybe check Craft Shack, check your local bottle shop, Total Wine. Heck, send an email to the brewer and ask them where you can get it, who the distributor is. Absolutely worth it. This was a fantastic beer. I would recommend this one all day long. Folks, that is today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live, just toggle on your notifications, hit that bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.